Welcome to my channel, The World of Science Fiction. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. The dust on Xylos was less a particle and more a statement. It was a fine, metallic grit that spoke of absolute sterility, of a world scoured down to its bones by a relentless stellar wind. Cale felt it in his teeth, a permanent film on his tongue that tasted of rust and finality. He stood at the viewport of his observation tower, watching the monolithic crawlers of the Omnicorp Consortium etch another deep scar into the moon's pale crust. Below him, the containment facility designated P7 was a geometric wound in the landscape, a place of hard lines and harder protocols. His official title was Warden, but the word felt hollow, an antique term for a modern function. He was a keeper, a custodian of corporate assets locked away from inconvenient eyes. He had once been an enforcer, a soldier in Omnicorp's brutal expansionist campaigns, but the fire for that work had long since cooled to embers. Now he managed locks, monitored vital signs of things that often had no vitals to speak of, and ensured the quarterly reports aligned with projected outputs. It was a quiet, orderly purgatory, and for a man who had seen too much chaos, it was almost a mercy. The recycled air in the tower hummed with a monotonous drone, a sound he had long ago stopped hearing. It was the same sound that filled his cramped living quarters, the mess hall, the long, white corridors of the facility. It was the sound of existence stripped of all variables. He ran a hand over his jaw, the rough scrape of stubble a small, familiar anchor in the profound emptiness. His reflection in the polarized glass was a ghost, a faded outline of a man he barely recognized, superimposed over the vast, dead plains of the moon. An alert chimed on his console, a soft, deferential tone that signified an incoming transport. He did not need to check the manifest. He already knew what was coming. Asset 734. The memo had been terse, coded with the highest level of corporate encryption. It spoke of a unique biological entity, a specimen of unparalleled potential and extreme hazard. The language was sterile, clinical, but beneath the jargon, Cale had sensed a tremor of something else. Fear. Corporations feared two things: loss of profit and loss of control. This new asset threatened both. He watched the transport descend, a black wedge against the bruised purple of the sky. It was a military-grade hauler, its hull scarred with the telltale marks of atmospheric re-entry and something more visceral, something that looked like weapon impacts. It settled onto the landing pad with a sigh of stressed metal, its engines casting shimmering waves of heat that distorted the already bleak horizon. The docking ramp lowered, revealing a cavernous interior shrouded in shadow. Cale descended from his tower, his boots echoing on the grated metal stairs. He moved with an economy of motion learned in violent places, a quiet efficiency that was now just muscle memory. He met the transport crew at the airlock, their faces hidden behind the reflective visors of their environment suits. They did not speak. They handed him a data slate, and he pressed his thumb to its surface. His clearance flashed green. The manifest was as sparse as the memo. Subject designation, 0. Origin, classified. Special handling protocols were listed in excruciating detail, a long litany of energy field frequencies, atmospheric compositions, and sedative dosages. He scrolled through the pages of technical specifications for the containment unit, a massive, electromagnetically sealed crate that was now being levitated from the transport's belly by a team of loader mechs. It hummed with contained power, a deep thrum that he could feel in the deck plates. He led the procession into the facility, down to the deepest level, sublevel Gamma. This was where they kept the things that Omnicorp wanted to understand, but did not dare to set free. The corridor walls were thick with lead and reinforced alloys, designed to absorb radiation, kinetic force, and exotic energies Cale could not even name. The air grew colder, scrubbed clean of even the ubiquitous dust. The final chamber was a sphere of polished obsidian-like material, the containment theater. The crate was lowered into the center of the room. Its locking mechanisms hissed open, and the sides fell away, revealing not another box, but a column of shimmering, golden light. Suspended within the light, caught in a stasis field that held her motionless, was a creature of impossible form. She was humanoid in basic structure, tall and slender, but her skin seemed to be woven from solidified twilight, shifting with colors that had no name. Her limbs were long, her features angular and severe, yet possessed of a strange, alien grace. Long, silver hair floated around her head as if she were underwater. She was a thing of myth, a goddess trapped in a corporate machine. She was Subject Zero. Cale stared, his professional detachment fracturing for the first time in years. He had seen aliens before, dozens of species cataloged and exploited by Omnicorp. They were biological creatures, flesh and blood and bone. This was different. She felt less like a specimen and more like a captured law of nature. Her eyes were closed, but he felt a pressure in his mind, a faint, inquisitive touch, like a whisper just below the range of hearing. The technicians in their sterile suits bustled around the stasis column, making adjustments, their voices tinny over the comms. They were checking the integrity of the field, reinforcing the very cage that held this impossible beauty. One of them pointed a diagnostic tool at her, and a thin beam of red light lanced out, striking her shoulder. She did not flinch, held immobile by the field, but Cale saw a flicker of something across her face, a tightening around the mouth that looked like pain. And deep within his mind, that silent whisper sharpened into a spike of pure agony. He recoiled, his hand flying to his temple. The sensation vanished as quickly as it came, leaving behind a phantom ache. He looked at the technician, then back at the captive. They were hurting her. The diagnostic tool was not just scanning. It was a punitive measure, a low-level energy prod designed to ensure compliance, even in a creature that could not move. It was protocol. He stood there for a long time after the technicians had left, alone in the silent, cold theater with the being in the column of light. He watched the rhythmic pulse of the stasis field, a golden cage for a creature of starlight. He saw the subtle tension in her suspended form, the rigid set of her jaw. She was not sleeping. She was enduring. He thought of his own life, a different kind of stasis, a long, gray endurance of protocol and procedure. He did not know what compelled him. It was not logic. It was not part of any procedure he had ever learned. It was an impulse, a flicker of the man he had been before the uniform and the corporation had ground him down. He walked to the control pedestal, his gloved fingers hovering over the glowing interface. He accessed the containment parameters, the screen showing a complex schematic of the energy field. He located the subsystem-designated compliance enforcement grid. It was a secondary layer, a web of pure energy designed to inflict discomfort, to break a will. It was standard procedure for high-threat assets. He hesitated for only a second. With a decisive tap, he deactivated it. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The golden light of the stasis column did not flicker, it erupted. A wave of raw power, a silent, concussive force, blasted outward from the captive. The control pedestal in front of Cale exploded in a shower of sparks, throwing him backward against the far wall. The obsidian-like walls of the chamber cracked, spiderwebbing with fractures that glowed with an internal, angry light. Red alarm klaxons blared to life, their shrieking wail accompanied by the sudden, jarring shutdown of the primary power grid. The humming drone of the station died, replaced by an echoing, terrifying silence broken only by the insistent alarms. In the center of the room, the stasis column flickered and died. For a moment, the creature, Lyra, hung in the air, untethered. Then her eyes snapped open. They were pools of liquid silver, and they fixed on him with an intensity that burned through the gloom. She dropped to the floor, landing with an impossible lightness. The power she had unleashed was a key, and his small act of mercy had turned it in the lock. The facility's emergency lights kicked in, casting the scene in a hellish red glow. The heavy blast door to the containment theater began to grind shut, a slow, final curtain of reinforced steel. Over the station-wide comm, a voice, cold and laced with fury, cut through the alarms. It was Warden Valerius. Security to sublevel Gamma. Hostile asset has breached containment. Terminate on site. Seal the sector, then, a more personal directive, find Warden Cale. He is responsible. Bring him to me. Cale pushed himself to his feet, his ears ringing. He was a traitor, a target. His quiet purgatory had just become a battlefield, and he was on the wrong side. He looked at Lyra. She stood poised, her head tilted as she listened to the sounds of approaching boots, the metallic clang of soldiers taking up positions outside the door. She was powerful, he had no doubt of that, but she was also disoriented, weakened by her capture and confinement. Alone, she would be cornered and destroyed. Alone, so would he. The blast door was halfway down. He made a decision born of pure survival instinct. He sprinted toward her, grabbing her arm. Her skin was cool, smooth as polished stone. She turned her silver eyes on him, and he saw not malice, but a fierce, burning intelligence. There was no time for words, no common language to bridge the gap between them. He simply pointed to a maintenance hatch in the floor, one he knew led to the labyrinthine network of service tunnels beneath the facility. She understood. As the first plasma bolts from the security team began to slag the descending blast door, she moved. She was not just fast, she flowed. They reached the hatch just as the main door sealed shut, plunging the room into near darkness. Kale wrenched it open, revealing a dark, vertical shaft descending into the guts of the station. He gestured for her to go first. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, her gaze searching his, then she dropped into the darkness without a sound. He followed, pulling the heavy hatch closed above them just as the security team breached the chamber. They were in a tight, vertical conduit, thick with cables and pipes coated in the ever-present dust. The only light came from the thin cracks around the hatch above. The air was stale, smelling of ozone and lubricant. Below them, a ladder descended into blackness. They began to climb down, the sound of their movements swallowed by the vast, mechanical silence of the station's underbelly. There was no trust between them yet, only a shared enemy and a desperate, fragile alliance forged in the fire of their escape. He was no longer a warden. He was a fugitive, and his charge was not an asset, but a being of unknown power who had just become his only hope of seeing another cycle. The service tunnels were a maze, a forgotten world beneath the clean, white corridors of the facility. They navigated by the faint glow of emergency conduits and Kale's ingrained knowledge of the station's layout. The sounds of the hunt were ever present above them. The methodical thump of magboots on deck plates, the distorted crackle of comms, the distant, angry shouts. Valerius had locked down the entire moon. There was no way out, only deeper in. Lyra moved with a silent grace that belied the urgency of their flight. She seemed to see in the oppressive dark, her silver eyes catching the faint light and reflecting it back. Kale, for his part, relied on memory and the tactical readouts that still scrolled through his mind from years of training. He led them through cramped ventilation shafts, across precarious catwalks spanning chasms filled with humming machinery, and along pipes slick with condensation. He was her guide in this world of steel and wire, and she was his shield. The first real test of their partnership came at a primary junction nexus, a cavernous space where power conduits from the main reactor converged. They had to cross an open gantry to reach the sublevels that led to the old, abandoned landing bays. It was a trap. As they stepped into the open, floodlights blazed to life, pinning them in a merciless white glare. From all sides, figures in black armor rappelled down from the darkness above, their plasma rifles leveled. "Hold your fire," a voice boomed, amplified and harsh. A man stepped out from behind a thick conduit, his armor a more ornate, officer's grade. He removed his helmet, revealing a face sharp with cruel ambition. It was Sergeant Jorik, Valerius's fanatical right hand. His eyes, cold and humorless, fixed on Kale. "Warden Kale, traitor, you will surrender the asset and submit to judgment." Kale pushed Lyra behind him, his hand instinctively going to the sidearm he still carried. It felt like a child's toy against the firepower arrayed against them. "The asset is a person, Jorik. You're making a mistake." Jorik laughed, a short, barking sound. "It is a thing, a weapon, and you are a fool who has thrown his life away for it. Now, step aside, or we will cut through you to get to it." He raised his rifle, the weapon's charging coils whining with lethal intent. There was no escape. They were surrounded, outgunned, and exposed. Kale prepared himself for the inevitable. He would not surrender her. He did not know why, but that one conviction was absolute. He braced for the impact, for the searing heat of a plasma bolt. It never came. Lyra stepped out from behind him. She raised a hand, not in surrender, but as if to feel the air. The oppressive glare of the floodlights seemed to bend around her, the air itself growing thick and heavy, charged with an invisible energy. Jorik's sneer faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. "Fire," he commanded, his voice tight. The security team opened up, a dozen rifles unleashing a torrent of incandescent energy. But the bolts never reached their target. A few feet in front of Lyra, they simply stopped, dissolving into harmless showers of light against a barrier that was not there. A shield of pure force had sprung into existence around them, shimmering like heat haze. Lyra closed her eyes. The deck plates beneath their feet began to vibrate, a low hum that grew into a deep, resonant thrum. She swept her hand outward in a gentle arc. The hum became a roar, a wave of kinetic force, visible only as a ripple of distortion in the air, erupted from her. It struck the surrounding soldiers like a physical blow. They were thrown from their positions, their armor clattering against the walls and gantries. Rifles flew from their hands. The floodlights shattered, plunging the Nexus into darkness once more. Jorik, caught in the blast, was hurled against the conduit he had been hiding behind. He slumped to the ground, stunned but conscious, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. Lyra did not press the attack. The effort seemed to have cost her. She swayed on her feet, a faint tremor running through her body. Kale caught her, steadying her. Her skin was now cold to the touch. They did not wait for Jorik to recover. They fled into the darkness, leaving the disabled squad and their enraged commander behind. As they ran, Kale glanced back. Jorik was already on his feet, his face contorted with hate. Shouting into his comm, the hunt was no longer just a matter of corporate protocol. It was personal. In that moment, crossing that gantry, something had shifted between Kale and Lyra. He had been willing to die for her, and she had unleashed an impossible power to save him. It was not trust, not yet. It was something more fundamental, a recognition of mutual defense. They were no longer a warden and a prisoner. They were survivors, bound together by the violence of their pursuers. Their destination was a derelict comms relay at the northern pole of the moon, a relic from the initial colonization survey, long since abandoned by Omnicorp. It was their only chance. If he could slice into the old network, he might be able to bypass the corporate jammers and send a message to the wider galaxy, to expose what Valerius was doing. It was a slim hope, but it was the only one they had. To get there, they had to go outside. They found an old emergency airlock in a forgotten storage bay, its seals cracked and brittle. It took all of Kale's strength to cycle it manually. As the outer door ground open, the environment of Xylos hit them. It was a physical assault. The wind was a knife, carrying the razor-sharp metallic dust. The temperature was well below freezing, a cold so profound it felt like it could shatter bone. The sky was a swirling vortex of dark clouds, lit by the faint, ghostly light of a distant nebula. They had no environment suits. Kale's uniform offered minimal protection. He felt the cold sink into him instantly, a deep, numbing ache. He looked at Lyra, expecting her to suffer as well. But she seemed almost unaffected. She tilted her head back, her silver hair whipping in the wind, and took a deep breath of the thin, toxic air. A faint luminescence began to glow beneath her skin, a soft, internal light that seemed to hold the worst of the cold at bay. She was alien to this place, yet more at home in its harshness than he was. The journey across the surface was an ordeal. They moved through a landscape of jagged rock formations and vast, flat plains of dust, all of it sculpted by millennia of relentless wind. The ground crunched under Kale's boots, each step an effort in the low gravity. He shivered uncontrollably, his body fighting a losing battle against the encroaching hypothermia. They were being hunted. Twice, they had to take cover in deep crevasses as Omnicorp patrol craft swept overhead, their searchlights cutting sterile paths through the darkness. During one of these enforced halts, huddled together for warmth in the lee of a towering rock spire, Lyra reached out and placed her hand on his chest. Her touch was still cool, but where her fingers rested, a gentle warmth began to spread through him, pushing back the deadly cold. It was a small act, a simple transfer of her own energy to him, and it probably saved his life. He looked at her, his breath frosting in the air between them, and saw a flicker of concern in her silver eyes. He nodded his thanks. No words were needed. They traveled for what felt like days, the passage of time marked only by the slow wheeling of the stars above. The derelict relay tower finally appeared on the horizon, a skeletal finger of rust and decay pointing accusingly at the sky. It was a ghost of a dead era, a testament to failed ambitions. As they drew closer, Cale felt a new kind of dread. The place felt wrong. There was a silence around it that was deeper than the natural quiet of the moon. The entrance was buried under a drift of metallic dust. They dug their way in, finding themselves in a circular room filled with archaic technology. Consoles were dark, their screens cracked. Dust lay thick on every surface. But in the center of the room, a single holographic projector flickered, casting a weak, unstable image into the air. Lyra walked toward it, her movements slow and deliberate. She placed her hand on the projector's lens. The air shimmered. The projector flared to life, not with data, but with light. The light flowed from Lyra, through the machine, and coalesced into a series of vivid, three-dimensional images that filled the room. Cale stumbled back, his mind reeling as the images flooded his consciousness. They were not just pictures, they were memories, feelings, a story told without a single word. He saw a world, not of rock and dust, but of living crystal, a planet that sang with light and energy. He saw Lyra's people, the Lumina, beings of pure energy who had built cities of woven light. He saw them not as individuals, but as a single, vast consciousness, a collective mind that lived in harmony with its world. He felt their peace, their timeless existence. Then he saw the arrival of Omnicorp. He saw the first survey ships, the first drills that bit into the crystalline surface of their world. He felt the collective shock, the pain of the planet itself as the mining began. The resource Omnicorp was harvesting, the priceless xylos, 7 crystal, was not a mineral. It was the crystallized, dormant form of the Lumina consciousness. It was their bodies, their souls. The corporation was not mining a moon, it was strip mining a graveyard. He saw the Lumina retreat, their consciousness withdrawing deep into the planet's core, entering a profound stasis to protect themselves from the desecration. Only a few, the Guardians, remained awake. Lyra was one of them. He saw her fight, a desperate, lonely battle against the machines and the men who served them. He saw her capture, the pain of the stasis field, the long, silent journey to the prison on Xylos. The final image was of Warden Valerius. He was younger, standing over a deep mining shaft, looking at a pulsating crystal formation at its bottom, the heart of the Lumina. And Cale felt the knowledge that flooded from the image. Valerius knew. He had known from the beginning. He knew he was committing genocide for profit, and he had built the entire security apparatus on Xylos not just to protect his operation, but to hide his monstrous secret. The images faded, leaving Cale on his knees, gasping for breath. The truth was a physical weight, crushing him. His entire career, his life, had been in service to this atrocity. He was a cog in a machine of extinction. He looked up at Lyra. Her face was etched with a sorrow so deep it seemed ancient. She had shown him her truth, her people's pain. She had given him a cause. He struggled to his feet, his body aching with cold and newfound purpose. Valerius, he said, the name tasting like poison. He has to be stopped. As if summoned by his voice, the comm system in the old relay station crackled to life. It was a priority signal, bleeding over from the Omnicorp network. Jorik's voice, sharp and triumphant. Subject has been tracked to the old northern relay. All units converge. The warden wants this finished. No survivors. Outside, the sky began to fill with the dark shapes of dropships. The hunt had found them. They were trapped. The relay station was a tomb, and Valerius's army was descending to seal it. Cale worked feverishly at one of the ancient consoles, trying to coax some life from its dead circuits. He needed to activate the station's old defensive grid, a system of kinetic barriers that hadn't been powered in decades. It was a futile gesture, a way to buy them minutes when they needed days. Lyra stood at the crumbling viewport, watching the dropships land and disgorge squads of heavily armed soldiers. They were forming a perimeter, a closing circle of death. She was calm, her expression unreadable. The display of her past had taken a toll. The light under her skin was dimmer now, her energy reserves clearly depleted. She had saved him in the Nexus, but she could not fight an entire battalion. It's no good, Cale said, slamming his fist on the dead console. The core power conduit is severed. I can't bring the shields online. He looked at the tactical display he had managed to coax onto a flickering screen. It showed their position as a single red, surrounded by a sea of approaching blue markers. It was a portrait of an unwinnable war. He expected to see fear or despair in Lyra's eyes when he turned to her. Instead, he saw a quiet resolve. She walked away from the window and came to stand before him. She placed her fingers on his temple. Another wave of understanding flowed into him, not a history this time, but a plan. A terrible, final solution. She showed him the heart, the central nexus of her people's consciousness, buried deep beneath the main mining facility. She showed him how Omnicorp's drill was tapped directly into it, siphoning its energy, slowly bleeding her entire race to death. But she also showed him a way to stop it. The connection could be severed. The heart could be sealed away again, placed into a protective stasis so deep that Omnicorp's technology could never touch it. But the process required a key, a bridge. A conscious, organic mind would have to interface with the heart's control system, guide the energy flow, and then become a permanent part of the seal. The mind would have to absorb the feedback of an entire civilization entering hibernation. It would be an agony beyond comprehension. The individual would cease to exist, their consciousness dissolving into the greater whole, their body becoming a living, crystalline lock. A warden, in the truest sense of the word. A silent guardian for eternity. The understanding settled in Kale's soul with the cold weight of a shroud. She could not do it herself. Her energy signature was too compatible. She would be absorbed instantly, without the resistance needed to form the seal. It had to be someone else. It had to be a human. It had to be him. The impossible choice was not a choice at all. It was a destination. He looked at the tactical map, at the closing ring of soldiers. They could fight, and they would die, and the slow genocide of the Lumina would continue. Or he could face a different kind of death, a dissolution of self that might save an entire species. His life, a meaningless sequence of orders followed and contracts fulfilled, versus the existence of a whole race. He thought of the badge he metaphorically wore, the title of warden. He had been a jailer, a guard of corporate secrets. This was a chance to be something more. To protect. To serve a purpose greater than a paycheck. It was a horrifying, beautiful, and utterly final path. He pulled away from her touch, the mental contact breaking. He walked to the viewport, looking out at the advancing lights of Jorik's forces. The wind howled outside, throwing dust against the reinforced glass. He saw his own reflection again, but this time, it was not the face of a ghost. It was the face of a man with a decision to make. He spent a long time in silence, the weight of ages pressing down on him. He had never been a man of faith or grand ideals. He had been a survivor. He had done what was necessary to get to the next day. But Lyra had shown him something else. She had shown him a cause worth more than mere survival. She had shown him a people who deserved to live, and she had trusted him with their truth. He turned back to her. She was watching him, her silver eyes filled with a profound sorrow, but also a sliver of hope. She was not asking him to do this. She was merely presenting the truth of their situation. The choice was his alone. He gave a single, slow nod. That was all. No grand speech. No declaration of martyrdom. Just a simple gesture of acceptance. He accepted the path. He accepted the cost. A flicker of something like gratitude, mingled with immense pain, crossed her face. She reached out and touched a long-healed scar on his forearm, a jagged line from a shrapnel wound he had taken in some forgotten corporate war. In her touch, he felt a shared understanding of pain, of scars both visible and unseen. It was a silent vow, a soldier's pact made between two disparate worlds. The time for deliberation was over. The time for action had come. How do we get back to the main facility? He asked, his voice rough. How do we get to the heart? Lyra's response was not a mental image, but an action. She walked to the far wall of the relay station, a solid wall of rock and rusted metal. She placed her palms against it. The faint light under her skin intensified, glowing with a fierce, white-hot brilliance. The wall began to groan, to fracture. With a deafening shriek of protesting stone and steel, a section of the moon's crust tore open, revealing a dark tunnel, ancient and clearly not man-made. It was a hidden way, a path known only to her people. It was their road to the final confrontation. They plunged into the tunnel, the roar of collapsing rock behind them sealing the entrance, and, for a moment, burying the sounds of Jorik's advancing army. The passage was impossibly old, the walls smooth and cool, pulsing with a faint, internal luminescence that guided their way. It was a vein running through the heart of the moon, a secret path that bypassed the surface and all of Omnicorp's patrols. The journey was a descent into silence. The sounds of their footsteps were absorbed by the strange, crystalline rock. Kale felt a growing pressure in his mind, a sense of immense, sleeping power just beyond the walls. It was the dormant consciousness of the Lumina, a silent sea of dreams. He was walking toward the center of their soul. He walked beside Lyra, their shoulders occasionally brushing in the narrow passage. The bond between them had transcended the need for language. It was a fabric woven from shared danger, mutual respect, and the solemn weight of the task ahead. He was no longer just a man. He was an instrument of salvation. And she was no longer just an alien. She was the hope of her people, entrusting that hope to a stranger from the stars. The tunnel eventually opened into a vast cavern, a natural grotto of breathtaking scale. Great, luminous crystals grew from the floor and ceiling like the trees of a petrified forest, casting a soft, blue light over everything. In the center of the cavern, the tunnel ended abruptly, opening onto a view of the main Omnicorp mining operation from below. They were looking up the central bore shaft, a colossal wound drilled deep into the moon. Far above, they could see the underside of the main drilling platform. And far, far below, bathed in an ethereal glow, was the heart. It was a crystalline sphere of immense size, pulsating with a slow, rhythmic light, like a sleeping titan. Even from this distance, Kale could feel its power, a gentle, overwhelming presence that made the air hum. The main drill bit, a monstrous piece of machinery, was attached to it, a parasite sucking the life from its host. Valerius will be there, Kale said, his voice a low whisper in the vast cavern. He'll have the platform heavily guarded. Lyra looked up the shaft, her gaze fixed on the distant platform. The light in her skin flared, no longer gentle, but sharp and brilliant, like a star about to go nova. She was gathering her remaining strength, preparing for the final battle. She would be their distraction. She would be the storm that drew all eyes, while he, the quiet variable in the equation, slipped through to perform the final act. They began their ascent, using an old service ladder attached to the side of the bore shaft, a relic from the initial construction. It was a grueling climb, hand over hand, up the cold metal rungs. The scale of the operation was staggering. They were ants climbing a mountain of corporate greed. As they neared the platform, the sounds of the facility returned, the roar of the drill, the whine of machinery, the shouts of men. They emerged onto a maintenance catwalk just below the main deck. Peering through the grating, Kale could see them. Dozens of Omnicorp's elite guard, clad in their signature black armor, had formed a defensive perimeter around the drill's control nexus. And in the center of it all stood Warden Valerius and Sergeant Jorik. Valerius was a man who radiated an aura of absolute control. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his immaculate uniform a stark contrast to the industrial grime of the platform. Jorik stood beside him, his plasma rifle held at the ready, his eyes scanning the shadows, hungry for a target. "She will come," Valerius said, his voice calm, amplified by the platform's comm system. "The asset is drawn to this place. It is a weakness we will exploit. Jorik, the moment you have a clean shot, you take it." That was their cue. Lyra placed a hand on Kale's shoulder, a final, silent farewell. Then she launched herself from the catwalk. She did not leap. She ascended, rising into the center of the vast chamber like a vengeful angel. All light in the cavern seemed to dim, drawn into her form. She blazed with power, a figure of pure, incandescent rage. Every soldier, every weapon, turned toward her. "There!" Jorik screamed, raising his rifle. "Fire at will." The air filled with a storm of plasma fire, a crisscrossing web of deadly energy, all converging on the lone figure in the air. This was Kale's chance. While the battle raged above, he slipped from the catwalk and sprinted across the deck, using the massive machinery as cover. He moved with the deadly grace of his old life, a ghost in the chaos. The soldiers were focused entirely on Lyra, who was now a whirlwind of light and force, their plasma bolts dissipating against her shields as she unleashed waves of kinetic energy that sent men and equipment flying. He reached the control nexus. It was a raised dais, at its center a console that plunged a series of thick conduits directly into the head of the main drill. This was the interface. This was the keyhole. He vaulted onto the dais, his fingers flying over the control panel, overriding the security lockouts with codes he had memorized years ago. A transparent, helmet-like device rose from the console, the neural interface. He took one last look at the battle. Lyra was magnificent, a goddess of war holding an army at bay. But he could see the cost. The light around her was beginning to flicker. She was burning herself out to buy him these precious seconds. He saw her glance toward him, a final acknowledgement across the battlefield. He did not hesitate. He pulled the neural interface over his head. Pain. Not physical pain, but the pain of a mind being torn open. It was a flood of pure information, a billion voices screaming in silence. He felt the consciousness of the Lumina, their collective agony, their long, patient dream. He was at the shore of an infinite ocean, and the tide was coming in. His training kicked in. The mental conditioning he had undergone as an enforcer, designed to resist interrogation and psychic intrusion, became his only anchor. He held onto the fragile raft of his own identity, his own self, as the psychic tsunami crashed over him. He found the central thread in the chaos, the control sequence Lyra had shown him. He focused on it, pouring all of his will, all of his being, into that single task. On the console, lights flashed from red to green. A deep, resonant tone echoed through the chamber, a sound that seemed to come from the very bones of the moon. The great drill bit shuddered, its connection to the heart weakening. He felt his body beginning to change. A strange numbness spread through his limbs. He looked down at his hands on the console. They were becoming translucent, the flesh and bone slowly transmuting into a crystalline substance that glowed with a soft, internal light. The process was agonizing, a slow-motion explosion of every cell in his body. He was becoming the seal. Valerius saw him. The warden's cold composure finally broke, his face twisting into a mask of pure fury. "Stop him," he shrieked, pointing a trembling finger. "That's my facility. That's my prophet." Jorik, recovering from a blast wave, turned his attention from Lyra. He saw Kale at the console, saw the transformation. With a roar of rage, he charged, leveling his rifle for a final, point-blank shot. He never reached him. Lyra, with the last of her strength, unleashed a focused lance of pure force. It struck Jorik, lifting him off his feet and encasing him in a shimmering field of energy before flinging him into the far wall, where he was held, conscious but paralyzed. Kale's vision was fading, the physical world dissolving into a symphony of light and energy. He was one with the machine, one with the heart. He gave the final mental command. "Seal." A wave of pure, placid energy erupted from the heart. It was not violent. It was not destructive. It was a wave of absolute nullification. As it washed over the platform, every piece of OmniCorp technology simply ceased to function. The roar of the drill died. The lights went out. The whine of plasma rifles faded into silence. Valerius's comm unit went dead. The entire, vast engine of oppression was switched off in an instant. The soldiers stood dumbfounded, their useless weapons hanging limp in their hands. Valerius stared, his mouth agape, at his silent, powerless kingdom. In the sudden, profound silence, the war was over. Kale's last sensation of self was of Lyra's presence, a gentle touch in his dissolving mind, a whisper of gratitude, a universe of sorrow. Then, he was gone, his identity subsumed into the eternal, silent duty he had chosen. He was the warden. He was the seal. He was at peace. 10 years later, the moon named Xylos was no longer a name on a corporate ledger. It was a sanctuary, a protected world under the jurisdiction of a new galactic treaty. The fall of OmniCorp had been swift and total. The revelations of the Xylos atrocity had sent shockwaves through the galaxy, toppling the corporate giant and leading to sweeping reforms. The age of unchecked corporate expansion was over. The moon itself was healing. The great scars of the strip mining operations were slowly being filled in, not by machines, but by nature itself. Faint, crystalline flora had begun to sprout from the metallic dust, delicate structures that glowed with a soft, internal light, catching the rays of the distant star and turning the desolate plains into fields of quiet beauty. The air was still thin, but it was cleaner, the metallic tang replaced by a scent like ozone after a storm. Peace had been costly, but it was enduring. Humanity had been forced to look at itself, at the voracious greed that had driven it to the brink of committing a silent, industrial genocide. And from that introspection, a new path had been chosen. Tentative diplomatic channels had been opened with the slowly awakening Lumina. It was a dialogue conducted not with words, but with gestures of respect, with a shared understanding of the fragility of life. Lyra was the bridge. She moved between the two worlds, a guide for humanity and a voice for her people. She had taught them about the Lumina's collective consciousness, about their connection to the living world, and in turn, she had learned about humanity's strange, fierce individuality, their capacity for both great cruelty and profound sacrifice. She often returned to the main facility, now a silent, powerless monument. The Great Drill was still a relic of a bygone era of violence. The soldiers who had been stationed there had been evacuated, their armor and weapons left behind where they had fallen silent, monuments to a war that had ended not with a bang, but with a whisper of absolute peace. Even Valerius had been taken away, a broken man stripped of his power, left to face the justice of a galaxy he had tried to exploit. Today, she stood on the central platform, before the control nexus. It was no longer a machine of industry. It had become a shrine. Where the neural interface had been, a statue now stood. It was a perfect, crystalline figure of a man in a warden's uniform, his hands resting on the console. It was Kale, his form captured at the exact moment of his transformation, his features locked in an expression of solemn, focused resolve. He was part of the crystal now, part of the moon, part of the great, silent consciousness he had died to protect. The crystal that was his body pulsed with a faint, steady light, a slow, rhythmic beat that was the new, protected heartbeat of the Lumina. He was the lock, the seal, the guardian. His sacrifice was not an act of death, but an act of becoming. He had become the peace. He had become the law that no weapon could defy. Lyra reached out and placed her palm against the crystalline cheek of the statue. It was cool to the touch, and through it, she could feel the vast, peaceful slumber of her people. And somewhere, in the deepest abyss of that collective mind, she could feel him. A flicker of his consciousness, a ghost of his identity, still remained. A single, steadfast point of will, standing in eternal watch. He was not gone. He was simply on duty. A soft breeze, the first true wind of a healing world, swept across the platform, carrying with it the scent of the new, crystalline blossoms. It stirred her silver hair as she stood in silent communion with the man who had traded his life for the soul of her world. His legacy was in the silence, in the gentle light of the healing land, in the hope of a future where two such different peoples could learn to coexist. The cost had been one man's entire existence, but the peace he had bought was for everyone, and it was forever. The jaded soldier had become a true warden, and in his eternal, silent vigil, he had finally found his purpose.